When my husband died, I expected pain. What I didn't expect was that the worst of it wouldn't come from losing him, but from my own son. My husband Harold passed away quietly in his sleep on a Thursday morning. The hospice nurse told me it was peaceful. I was in the next room, heating a bowl of oatmeal he hadn't asked for. I had been doing that a lot in the final weeks, clinging to small rituals, cooking for a man who barely had the strength to chew, folding his clothes when he no longer left the bed. I thought if I just kept acting like everything was normal, maybe I wouldn't feel the weight of what I already knew. He was gone, and I was alone. I called David first, our only son. He answered after the third ring and didn't say much. Just told me, "I'll take care of everything." I should have known right then. That tone, flat, controlled. It wasn't grief. It was something else. Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. He arrived 2 hours later with Cynthia, his wife. They didn't hug me. Cynthia gave me that look she always does, like I was an object out of place in her life. David walked straight into the bedroom, stared at his father's body for a few seconds, then turned and said, "We should call the mortuary. I'll handle that." Not theirs. No hand on my shoulder, just logistics. The hospice nurse tried to offer condolences. Cynthia interrupted her mid-sentence to ask about the death certificate timeline. I remember sitting on the edge of the couch, clutching my robe closed at the neck with one hand and gripping my wedding band with the other. I had worn it for 42 years. It suddenly felt like it didn't belong to me anymore. That night, David told me he would be arranging the funeral. "It's better if we just keep it simple. You don't need to worry about anything." I asked when the service would be. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "It's private, Mom, just close family." I blinked. I am close family. He didn't flinch. "It's complicated. Cynthia thinks it's best if we avoid tension. You staying here is already enough." I sat there in silence, not understanding. My ears rang. I thought I'd misheard. "You mean I can't attend my own husband's funeral?" He stood up. "It's not about you. It's about peace. Just let it happen without turning it into something." And just like that, I wasn't invited. I wasn't wanted. The next morning, the house was quiet. David and Cynthia were gone, early, apparently. No note, no call. The bedroom door I was staying in, their guest room, had been locked from the outside. I tried the handle 3 times before I understood. Locked in, like a child, or worse, a burden. I sat on the bed and stared at the door. The curtain was drawn, and the room was dim. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared. My hands trembled, but not from sadness. It was something else building, something colder. That afternoon, I heard voices outside. I moved to the window and saw cars pulling into the driveway. Familiar faces. Harold's old coworkers. A neighbor, David, dressed in a dark gray suit, standing tall by the front porch, greeting people. That was the funeral. I was here, locked upstairs, watching from a window. It hit me all at once, the finality of it. The life I had with Harold, the house we built together, the son we raised, all reduced to silence and a locked door. Hours passed. The cars left. I didn't hear footsteps again until evening. Cynthia knocked once before opening the door. Her smile was tight. "We brought you something." She handed me a plastic container with leftover pasta salad. It went well, small, tasteful, just how Harold would have liked it. I couldn't speak. I just looked down at the container in my lap, the cold condensation dripping onto my skirt. Cynthia tilted her head. "You know, maybe it's time we talk about what comes next. The house, the accounts. David found some documents. We'll go over them in the morning." She walked out before I could reply. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the edge of the bed, the pasta untouched. Around midnight, I got up and opened the closet. Harold's old duffel bag was still there. It smelled faintly of cedar and something else, old leather. Inside, beneath a stack of faded shirts, I found the folder. It was wrapped in a blue hand towel. I unfolded it slowly. Inside were a set of documents I hadn't seen in years, copies of our joint accounts, a notarized letter from Harold, and something else. A will, not the version David mentioned last month. This one was dated 2 years ago, with Harold's signature fresh and clear. The line that stopped me was simple. "I leave all real property, assets, and holdings to my wife, Eleanor, with full authority to act independently in all financial and legal matters following my passing." I sat back on the floor, clutching the folder. My chest hurt, not from sadness, not even from betrayal. It was something deeper, recognition. He knew. Harold knew this might happen, that David might try something. He had left me the truth. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone and scrolled until I found the contact I hadn't used in years. Gerald Whitman, Harold's lawyer for over 3 decades. He had retired last year, but I remembered him telling me, "Call me if anything ever feels wrong." I hit call. It rang twice before I heard his voice. "Eleanor?" He sounded alert, even at midnight. "Yes," I whispered. "Gerald, I need you. I have something Harold left me, and my son doesn't want me to see it." There was a pause. Then, steady as ever, he said, "I'll be there in the morning." I didn't sleep after that. I folded the documents back into the towel and hid them inside my purse. Then I sat on the bed and waited, for morning, for Gerald. For the moment everything David thought he could take from me would slip through his fingers. And for the first time since Harold died, I felt something that had nothing to do with grief. I felt ready. I sat by the window until the morning light started to break through the clouds. I hadn't slept. The folder was inside my purse, zipped shut, resting on my lap like something alive. Every time I looked at it, I thought about Harold's signature, his words, the way he had quietly ensured that I wouldn't be erased. That our life, what we built, wouldn't be handed over to a woman who treated me like furniture. At exactly 8:04 a.m., I heard a car door shut. I stood up too quickly and felt dizzy, holding onto the bedpost. Then I moved toward the staircase and walked down slowly, cautiously, half expecting David or Cynthia to be standing at the front door, asking what I was doing out of my room. But it wasn't them. It was Gerald Whitman. He looked older than I remembered, thinner around the cheeks, but his walk was still steady, and he carried his briefcase like it weighed nothing. When he saw me through the glass of the front door, he smiled faintly and tapped the brass knocker once. I opened the door without a word and stepped back to let him in. "Eleanor," he said gently, "I came as fast as I could." We sat in the kitchen. I poured him a cup of coffee while my hands trembled just enough that he noticed. He didn't mention it. He never had been one to state the obvious. That was something Harold had always appreciated about him. "I take it things have become difficult," Gerald said after a sip of coffee. I opened the purse slowly and took out the folder, sliding it across the table. "They locked me in their guest room while they held Harold's funeral in the yard," I said quietly. "They didn't even let me say goodbye." Gerald's face stayed still, but I saw something shift in his eyes. He opened the folder and examined the contents one by one. He didn't rush. He always read every word, line by line, like every clause could detonate if ignored. When he finished, he folded his hands and looked up at me. "This," he said, tapping the top document, "is the real will. Dated, notarized, and signed in the presence of 2 witnesses. It supersedes anything David thinks he has." I swallowed hard. "What do I do now?" "You execute your rights," he said calmly. "You own this house. The accounts are in your name. You have full legal authority over everything Harold left, and you are not obligated to tolerate this treatment for another second." "I was afraid to even open a cabinet," I said, my voice cracking. "Cynthia said they were reorganizing the kitchen and that it wasn't my place to interfere." Gerald reached into his briefcase and pulled out a slim envelope. "Then it's time to remind them whose place it is." He had already drafted the preliminary notice of asset transfer, something Harold must have discussed with him long before the cancer took over. I stared at the document, suddenly breathless. "Gerald, did Harold know this would happen?" "He worried," he said. "He didn't trust David's intentions. He told me, more than once, if something happens to me, Eleanor needs protection, from my own son if it comes to that." I sat back, overwhelmed by the mixture of grief and betrayal. Gerald gave me time to process, then continued, "I can file this with the county this afternoon. It will trigger the transfer of title. Your name will be listed as sole owner of the property within 72 hours. I nodded slowly, still unsure of what to do with that power. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like survival. By noon, David and Cynthia returned from wherever they had gone. I was seated in the living room with Gerald, the signed notice on the coffee table. Cynthia barely glanced at us when she walked in. David did. His face tensed the moment he saw Gerald. "What's going on?" Gerald stood, calm and collected. "We're finalizing legal matters. Eleanor and I will be heading out shortly. She's requested to stay in her own home from this point forward, alone." David's brow furrowed. "This is my house." "No," Gerald said flatly, "it is not. As of today, all assets, including this property, revert to Eleanor under the terms of the will your father signed in 2023. The documents have already been initiated." David's mouth opened, then shut. His hands curled into fists. Cynthia scoffed. "That will's outdated." "Harold promised." "Harold didn't promise you anything," Gerald interrupted. "And even if he had, the law does not enforce promises made over dinner. What it enforces is documented intent. And Harold's documented intent is very clear." David stared at me, not with sorrow, not even with regret, just rage, cold and sharp. "You think this makes you the winner?" he asked. "No," I said. "I think it makes me your mother." He flinched, just slightly. I stood up and walked toward the stairs. "Pack your things," I said. "You have 24 hours." Gerald and I left together shortly after. I needed air. I needed distance from the echo of betrayal in every room. But I also needed one more thing: peace. That night, I returned home, alone. For the first time in what felt like years, the house was silent, not from grief, but from freedom. There were still ashes in the fireplace. Harold's slippers by the armchair. I didn't touch them, not yet. The next morning, I was still in my robe when the doorbell rang. I had barely finished my first cup of coffee, and my stomach was tight with nerves even before I peeked through the peephole. It was Cynthia. Her arms were crossed, and she didn't have a purse or even her phone in hand. Just that look she wore when she was about to do something calculated. I opened the door halfway and stayed in the frame. She didn't greet me. David wants to talk. Then David can come talk himself. She rolled her eyes. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, I said quietly. I'm making it honest. She inhaled sharply through her nose, her nostrils flaring just slightly. You know this is going to backfire, right? I didn't answer. I closed the door slowly and locked it without another word. 15 minutes later, my phone rang. It was David. I didn't answer. Then came the text. I hope you know what you're doing. You'll regret this. I set the phone down and stared out the kitchen window. It was a gray morning. Clouds hung low, and the air felt thick. But the silence inside the house was different now. Not empty, not lonely, just mine. I spent most of the day sorting through drawers Harold had left untouched during his illness. Some were filled with old receipts, some with photos of vacations, of our younger years. There were copies of investment accounts, insurance papers, things I had forgotten existed. But in the bottom drawer of his old writing desk, I found a smaller folder, a red one. Inside were bank statements, joint accounts in both our names, still active, untouched for months. And stapled to the back of them was a handwritten letter. If you're reading this, it means they tried to take everything. I'm sorry, Ellie. But I knew it might happen. Use these accounts if they push you. Everything in them is yours. And don't be afraid to use the attorney. Gerald knows what I wanted. I sat back, the letter shaking slightly in my hands. Harold had known, not just suspected, known. That evening, I called Gerald again. He answered on the first ring. Gerald, I said, there's more. Accounts Harold left me, with a letter. I need to secure them before David does anything. I'll come by tomorrow morning, he said. We'll take care of it. I spent the rest of the night listing every document I had, organizing them by date, by signature, by bank. By the time I finished, I had a full binder prepared. The next day, Gerald returned with a notary and copies of the transfer filings. We sat at the dining table, mine again, officially, and I signed everything in front of them. This locks it all in, he said. David can't dispute ownership now. If he tries, it'll only expose him to legal consequences. And what about the accounts? I asked. We'll move them to new ones in your name only, quietly, safely. By that afternoon, it was done. Everything Harold left me was secure. That night, David showed up at the front door. I didn't open it right away. He knocked 3 times, not urgently, but with forced patience. Through the peephole, he looked calm, but his jaw was tight. When I opened it, he didn't step forward. He held a manila envelope in his hand. This isn't over, he said. What is that? It's a petition, he said. Filed this morning. I'm contesting the will. I didn't take it from him. You have no legal ground. We'll see, he said flatly. He turned to leave, but then stopped halfway down the porch steps. You're going to destroy this family, he said without looking back. No, Irablia. You already did that. I'm just refusing to pretend anymore. He didn't respond, just walked to his car and drove off. Inside the envelope he left, there were copies of his petition. Most of it was filled with baseless accusations. That I influenced Harold while he was ill, that I withheld medication, that I isolated him from family. I read the whole thing sitting in the same armchair Harold used to sit in every evening. The next morning, Gerald filed the official response. He had already anticipated this kind of move. Everything was in place. The medical records showing Harold's mental clarity, the notary statements, the video file of Harold reading his will aloud, something Gerald had suggested doing, just in case. We included the handwritten letter, the accounts, the messages David had sent me, and the fact that they had locked me in a room while they buried Harold without me. It wasn't just sad anymore, it was a pattern. I didn't hear from David for 4 days after that. Then came a knock on the door again. This time, it was a courier. A formal letter. Mediation had been scheduled. David had lawyered up. The hearing would be in 2 weeks. I didn't feel nervous. I felt focused. The night before the hearing, I walked through every room in the house. I stood in the guest room where they'd locked me. I opened the drawer where I found the folder. I sat at the kitchen table where Gerald had explained every clause to me. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was preparing to finish one. The morning of the mediation hearing, I dressed carefully, not to impress anyone, but to remind myself who I was. Simple slacks, a beige sweater, and the gold watch Harold gave me on our 30th anniversary. I hadn't worn it since the diagnosis. I fastened it without hesitating. Gerald picked me up at 9:15. His expression was calm but firm. "Their attorney is aggressive," he warned as we pulled into the parking lot of the law offices where the hearing would be held. "But we're not here to be intimidated. We're here because your husband's will was valid and your rights were violated." Inside, the conference room was cold and impersonal. A long polished table, water bottles lined up, a mediator at the head of the table, and on the opposite side, David and Cynthia. Both were dressed in dark colors, trying to look serious and composed. Cynthia didn't meet my eyes. David did. His stare was flat, almost bored, as if this was all beneath him. The mediator began with a polite greeting, then read a short summary of the dispute: a contested will, claims of undue influence, and property disagreements. David's lawyer started speaking right away. "My client believes that Mr. Harold Renner was not of sound mind when he amended his will in 2023. Furthermore, he believes that Mrs. Eleanor Renner exerted pressure and manipulation during her husband's final year to isolate him from his children." I sat still. I didn't look at David. I didn't interrupt. Gerald waited for the lawyer to finish, then leaned forward. "My client, Mrs. Renner, has documentation showing Mr. Renner was mentally sound during the drafting of the 2023 will. We have medical records, notarized documents, and video evidence of his testimony. We also have messages from Mr. David Renner that indicate a pattern of harassment and emotional abuse toward his mother, including a deliberate act of confinement in his home during her husband's funeral. Shall I present those now?" The mediator nodded. Gerald opened his briefcase and placed the documents in front of the mediator, one by one, with precise movements. He spoke calmly, never raising his voice. "Here is the certified video from Harold Renner dated April 12, 2023, in which he reads and signs his final will. Here is the report from his physician confirming his cognitive clarity in that same week. Here is a notarized letter from his financial advisor supporting his capacity to make legal decisions." David's lawyer leaned back in his chair but didn't object. He couldn't. Then came the second part. "Additionally," Gerald continued, "we have a witness statement from the hospice nurse who cared for Mr. Renner in his final days. She recalls Mr. David Renner limiting his mother's access to basic information and events related to the funeral. And here," he said, placing the final document down, "is a signed letter from Harold Renner himself, addressed to his wife, indicating awareness of potential manipulation from their son. It clearly states his intention for her to receive all marital and personal property." David shifted uncomfortably. Cynthia crossed her legs and looked at the ceiling. The mediator reviewed everything silently, page by page. Finally, she spoke. "Given the amount of supporting evidence provided by Mrs. Renner, and the clarity of intent from Mr. Renner's documentation, I advise Mr. David Renner to withdraw the contestation and avoid further legal exposure." David didn't respond at first. Then he said, "My father didn't understand what he was doing. My mother twisted things. She made him think I was the enemy." His voice cracked for just a moment, but it didn't sound like sorrow. It sounded like frustration, like a child who didn't get what he wanted. I looked at him then, calmly. "Your father understood exactly what he was doing. He trusted me. You didn't." The mediator spoke again. "Mr. Renner, do you wish to proceed with the petition or withdraw?" David glanced at his lawyer, who gave him a quick, subtle shake of the head. He sighed loudly. "We'll withdraw." The room stayed silent for a long time. The mediator made some notes, then thanked everyone and stood. Cynthia stood next, grabbed her bag, and walked out without a word. David lingered. "I hope you're happy," he muttered. "I'm not," I replied, "but I'm safe. That's enough." Outside, Gerald walked me to his car. "You did well," he said simply. I didn't say much. "You didn't need to." That afternoon, I returned home, alone again, but this time the silence wasn't tense, it was clean, clear. I poured myself tea and sat in Harold's old chair. For the first time in months, I could breathe without that constant tightness in my chest. But peace didn't last long. That evening, Cynthia sent me a message. Just one sentence. "I hope you know we're not finished." I stared at it. I didn't reply. 2 days later, I received a certified letter in the mail. David had requested a full accounting of every asset Harold had owned in the final year. He was trying to find anything, to reopen the case. I forwarded the letter to Gerald. That night, I received another message, this time from an unknown number. "If you think the court will protect you forever, you're wrong. The harassment was subtle, but constant. Random phone calls in the middle of the night. Strange knocks on the door with no one there. Someone left an empty envelope in the mailbox with a single word written inside. Greedy. I didn't cry. I didn't break down. I installed a security system. I changed the locks. I bought a small, sturdy safe and placed every legal document inside it. A week later, Gerald called. I've contacted the court. If the harassment continues, we can request a protective order. But I suggest one more step. Something Harold would have wanted. What is it? I asked. Let's put the house in a living trust. That way, even if they try to challenge again, they won't touch it. I agreed. 3 days later, we finalized the paperwork. The house was now protected under a trust in my name, with clear instructions in the event of my death. David and Cynthia were explicitly excluded from any inheritance. That evening, I walked through the house again, room by room. I didn't just feel like a widow anymore. I felt like a survivor, but I also knew they weren't done yet. By the start of the following week, Gerald had received a formal notice from the court. David had filed a motion to reverse the terms of the trust. Even after the mediation hearing, even after the withdrawal of his petition, he was trying again, this time under a new strategy. His lawyer claimed that Harold had created the trust under mental confusion, and that I was hiding assets that rightfully belonged to the estate. Gerald wasn't surprised. They're trying to wear you down, he told me. It's not about winning. It's about making you so exhausted that you give up pieces to make it stop. I didn't reply right away. I was sitting at the dining room table, Harold's old fountain pen in my hand, turning it slowly between my fingers. The same pen he used to sign the revised will. I'm not tired yet, I said. Good, Gerald replied. Because we're going to court. No mediation this time. The hearing was scheduled for Tuesday, 2 weeks later. I spent the days leading up to it going over everything, paperwork, the bank records, the statements, the letters. Gerald met with me 3 times that week. Each time, he came prepared with notes, timelines, and questions. He didn't just believe in the case, he believed in Harold's voice, and that voice was now mine. The morning of the hearing, the air felt heavier than usual. The courthouse was busy, filled with people dealing with their own battles. I kept my eyes ahead and followed Gerald through the halls until we reached the courtroom. David and Cynthia were already seated at their table. She was wearing a fitted black blazer, hair tied back tight. David had his hands folded in front of him, tapping his thumb against the table in a steady rhythm. He didn't look at me when I walked in. The judge entered a few minutes later. She was firm, middle-aged, and didn't seem interested in drawn-out theatrics. That gave me a small comfort. David's attorney began with the same strategy they had used before, suggesting that I had manipulated Harold in his final months, that the changes to the will and trust were made under my influence, and that the estate had been unfairly diverted. Gerald stood when it was our turn. Your Honor, he said, calm but clear, what Mr. Renner and his counsel continue to ignore is the full body of legal documentation signed, notarized, and recorded long before Mr. Renner's decline in health. We have statements from his physician, 2 notaries, and his own testimony in video format. He handed over a copy of Harold's recorded declaration. Furthermore, he continued, the living trust was initiated months before Mr. Renner's condition worsened. We also have financial records showing that Mrs. Eleanor Renner made no unilateral decisions or withdrawals until after his passing. She has followed every legal step outlined by both the will and the trust. David's lawyer objected on procedural grounds, but the judge overruled him. Then Gerald played the video. It was simple. Just Harold sitting in his favorite armchair, speaking clearly, holding the signed document in his hands. He wasn't sick yet, not visibly. His voice was strong. I've revised this will because I want my wife to have everything. She's been with me for 42 years. I trust her, and I know my son won't like it, but this is my decision. The courtroom was quiet. Even Cynthia looked down at her lap. Gerald continued with the witness statements, the hospice nurse, the financial advisor, and the neighbor who saw me being locked in the guest room on the day of the funeral. The judge took it all in without speaking. After both sides presented, she requested a short recess. I stepped outside with Gerald. I didn't think it would hit me so hard, I said. That video? He asked. I nodded. His voice. Gerald gave a small nod. He knew what was coming. That's why he left it for you. When we returned to the courtroom, the judge sat quietly for a moment, reading her notes. Then she looked up. This court finds no evidence that Mrs. Eleanor Renner exerted undue influence. All documents provided were valid, properly filed, and consistent with the decedent's intentions. The trust will stand. The petition is denied. David stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. This isn't right, he snapped. He was confused. He didn't mean it. The judge didn't flinch. Sit down, Mr. Renner. But he didn't. He turned to me, and for the first time in months, I saw him without the mask. "You're nothing without him," he said. "You're just an old woman with a house full of paper." Gerald took a step forward, but I raised my hand. "I may be old," I said, "but I'm not the one standing in court trying to steal what doesn't belong to me." David's face flushed red. Cynthia tugged at his arm, but he shook her off and stormed out. The judge banged her gavel and closed the hearing. It was over. Outside, Gerald filed the final confirmation to secure the trust status permanently. We walked back to his car without speaking much. When he dropped me off at home, I paused before getting out. "Thank you," I said. He nodded. Harold would have been proud. I entered the house slowly. It felt different now, not like a battlefield, not like a place where something terrible had happened. It felt like mine. That night, I sat down and wrote a letter, not to David, not to Cynthia, just to myself. I didn't write much, just a few lines. "You didn't break, you didn't back down, and now, no one can take it away from you again." I folded the letter and placed it inside the safe, alongside the trust, the will, and Harold's final message. Then I went to bed and slept through the night for the first time in weeks. But even in the quiet, I had a feeling. David wouldn't give up completely, not yet. 3 weeks passed after the final court ruling. I didn't hear from David again. No letters, no calls, no messages. Cynthia disappeared with him, just as silent. At first, I expected another wave of confrontation, another surprise envelope or legal notice, but it never came. Instead, there was quiet. It felt unnatural at first. After everything, I wasn't used to silence meaning safety, but slowly, I began to believe in it. I woke up early every morning and made coffee without rushing. I opened windows without checking first who might be outside. I began cleaning rooms I hadn't touched in months. The guest bedroom, the one they had locked me in, was the first. I stripped the bed, boxed up the things they had left behind, and emptied the closet. In the back of that closet, I found something I hadn't expected, an old photo album I thought was lost. Harold and I, decades younger, standing on the steps of this same house. David was barely 5. I traced my finger over Harold's face in the picture. He looked proud, sure, safe. That afternoon, I called Gerald. "No trouble," I told him. "Nothing since the ruling." "That's good news," he said. "I filed all the final certifications. Everything's officially sealed now." We didn't speak long. There wasn't much left to say. It was done. The long process of reclaiming my place, my dignity, had reached its end. What came next was something else entirely, living again. One evening, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. It was my granddaughter, Hannah. She sounded nervous. "Grandma, it's me. I hope it's okay that I called." I hadn't heard her voice in nearly a year. David and Cynthia always made sure contact between us was limited, controlled. "I'm glad you did," I said. I saw the court stuff. I saw the papers. Dad said a lot of things that don't match what I found." I sat down, holding the phone tight. "What did you find?" I asked. "Letters, from Grandpa, old ones. He wrote about you, about what he wanted for you." She paused, her voice breaking. "I didn't know, Grandma. I didn't know what to think." "I'm sorry." "You don't have to be sorry," I said. "You just have to know the truth now." She was quiet again. Then, "Can I come visit?" "Yes," I said. "Anytime." 3 days later, she showed up with a small overnight bag and nervous eyes. She stood on the porch like she didn't know if she would be welcomed. I opened the door and hugged her before she could say a word. We sat at the kitchen table for hours. She asked questions, and I answered them as plainly as I could. About Harold, about the will, about David, about what happened at the funeral. She cried once, softly, not out of guilt, but from realizing how much had been hidden from her. Before bed, she walked through the house slowly. She stopped in Harold's office, ran her fingers along the old bookshelf, and said, "He kept everything." "Yes," I said, "that was his way." That night, after she went to sleep in the guest room, now clean, quiet, and mine again, I sat in the living room and opened my own box of things. I reread Harold's last letter, his handwriting steady even when his body wasn't. I thought about how he had seen all of this coming, how he had made a plan, not for himself, but for me. He couldn't stop David from becoming what he became, but he could leave me protected, he could leave me seen. A few days later, Hannah offered to help me set up online access to the trust and accounts. I had never been good with computers, but she sat next to me patiently and explained everything without judgment. "You have more in here than I thought," she said once, eyes wide. "Yes," I said, "but that's not the part that matters." I began donating small amounts, quietly, deliberately. A wing to the hospital where Harold had received treatment. A local legal fund for elderly women facing displacement. I didn't put my name on any of it. I didn't need to. David never reached out again, but Hannah kept calling and visiting. And one evening, months later, she brought her younger brother, Tim. He was cautious at first, polite but distant, but after dinner, he asked to see Harold's old record player. I showed him, and he played one of the old jazz records Harold loved. Then he smiled, just barely, and said, "I remember this." They remembered more than I thought. Cynthia once said I would die alone in that house, clinging to things that didn't matter, but she was wrong. I wasn't clinging to the past. I was standing in what remained of it, with pieces of the future beginning to return. I planted a rose bush in the backyard, near Harold's favorite chair. Nothing symbolic, just something real, something that needed time and care and space to grow. One morning, I opened the mailbox and found an envelope. Inside, there was a single sentence, written in David's handwriting. "You were always better at surviving than I thought." No apology, no signature. I folded the note and placed it in the safe, not because I needed to keep it, but because I needed to end it. And I did. I didn't answer. I didn't react. I just moved on.